杨以正，17岁。他的第一部英文小说《男爵之死》将于2025年1月在美国出版。在他乡北美访谈日前，在温哥华对他进行了采访。
我是 Leonardo Yang 杨以正，我来自温哥华。因为我中文不太流利，下面的问题会用英文来回答。When I was 5 years old, my dad introduced me to this game called Civilization 2. It was a strategic civilization building game. And because there weren't many books on the game that I could study from, I decided to read historical books in order to get a sort of sense of how I should play the game. And what I learned from the books were how ancient civilizations grew, survived, and fought with each other. And I really fell in love with history while reading those textbooks. And in doing so, I also transitioned to historical literature. And once I started writing my short stories, I incorporated a lot of these historical themes, which I found fascinating. And this sort of really kick-started my love for both reading and writing. When I was 11 years old, I asked my mom for a list of book recommendations, and the books she gave me were mostly authors from the Victorian era, such as Jane Austen or Charles Dickens. And after reading those books, I really fell in love with that era of time. And when I started writing my short stories, I would include a lot of historical themes that I had read up about from those authors. Last year, when I decided to reach my dream of writing my novel, I also included a lot of historical themes from those periods of time. And over the course of a year, I started writing what would become my novel. And its first draft, which was completed in around June, was about 60,000 words at its completion. Writing my novel was a decently smooth process. It did take some time for me just to research and plan and write out my novel. However, I always had this vision of what I wanted my story to turn out. I never really had any problem finding inspiration to overcome obstacles. Earlier this year, I submitted my manuscript to a publisher, and after 2 days, they came back with some positive feedback. They really liked the mystery and the dialogue, and then they felt that the audiences who read it would also enjoy this book as well. I think the Victorian era is one of the most interesting periods of history, and that's because there's just so much variation in terms of peoples, lands, and cultures, which are nominally connected to each other through these new technologies such as railroads, telegraphs, and steamboats. So you really have a lot of potential to gather a lot of different people and conflicting perspectives together for a new and interesting story. However, if you go further back into the medieval era, one problem you'll see is that a lot of people don't tend to move around. They tend to stay in the same area unless they're wealthy or explorers, which means that the amount of conflicting perspectives you can gather together for an interesting story decreases. I think if you go further ahead into the modern era, there's a different problem in that we have a lot of variation, but we're also used to each other in a globalized society. We've learned how to accept each other's differences, and there's a lot less room for conflict and for different perspectives to really change and explore. So I think the variation and the unfamiliarity of the Victorian era is what really makes it interesting. I did a lot of online studying and a lot of library research in order to write my novel set in the Victorian era. And one of the sources I used was London Labour and the London Poor, a survey of London's poverty during the Victorian era from that era. There's a lot of interesting sources in there, including first-hand accounts from interviews. And one of these interviews is with the watercress girl, as she's called, who's basically the starving East London vendor who's barely able to get by, and she's talking about her daily life and terrible conditions in East London. Another source I used in the writing of my novel is a writer's guide to everyday life in the Regency and Victorian England. And this book is very comprehensive. It talks about everything, including budgeting, food, and fashion, which was so incredibly useful for me to get a grip on how things were during the Victorian era. Other sources I used included newspapers, and I relied on two in particular, the Pall Mall Gazette and the Times, which were actual publications during the Victorian era. I mostly read the news sections and the cultural sections in order to get a glimpse of what the Victorian era journalists prioritized telling the public. And so I learned a lot of the different expectations and the different attitudes towards certain groups during the Victorian era, and I incorporated some of that into my story. And you'll see how differently women who are unmarried or who are widowed or who are married are treated compared to each other, which was really interesting. I wrote my murder mystery novels to be more like Agatha Christie's murder mystery novels, with a focus on psychology as an element behind my motivations and my reasonings. However, what I do think my novel differs from older murder mystery novels is that I'm able to incorporate a lot more modern knowledge, in a sense, into how my mysteries work. In the past, a lot of illnesses and diseases were considered incurable because they hadn't invented antibiotics yet, or the remedies that they used were either ineffective or outright deadly, such as the use of arsenic and mercury in certain treatments. While in the modern day setting, finding these chemicals would automatically equal suspicion in the eyes of law enforcement, my characters in the murder mystery novel have to sort of figure out whether these medicines were actually used to treat a disease or whether they were used in a murder. What I hope for the readers to get out of reading my novels, other than just having fun reading it, is a sort of appreciation for the modern day. Because in the past, there were all sorts of expectations, attitudes, and limitations, and poor living circumstances that people had to suffer through. And I want them to compare the different conditions of the Victorian era to those that we have today, and really appreciate the amount of progress it took for us to get here. My favorite character is Loma, the main character, because I had the most fun writing her. She's such a different character from me that I had to approach things in an entirely new attitude and manner. And she's also a woman in the Victorian era, meaning she was limited by certain social expectations. So she's expected to constantly defer to other authorities, such as men, and she's constantly expected to provide a sort of foundation for men to work off of. In order to progress the murder mystery novel, I had to find a way for Alma to really take charge without contravening those social conventions and lead to her being ignored, which was an entirely new challenge all on its own. While the other characters sort of give out their thoughts and their actions, I think it's Alma, whose voice we hear, that really drives it along and puts everything together and really pushes us down the murder mystery novel. Aside from Agatha Christie's murder mystery novels, I don't have a lot of interest in other murder mystery novels by other authors. And I think it's because a lot of those other authors and murder mystery novels aren't as audience or reader friendly as Agatha Christie's works are. For example, in Sherlock Holmes, a lot of cases are solved by self-referencing cases or facts or details within the own story or the own world that the author has created, making it very difficult for the reader to take charge when solving a murder mystery. If I were ever to recommend the readers here any novels, I would recommend those of three Victorian authoresses. One is Frances Hodgson Burnett, who wrote a lot of the nostalgic novels of the Victorian era, which were incredibly culturally influential. You'll find movies made about her books. Another is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which basically kickstarted the horror genre. A third is Kate Chopin, who wrote a lot of feminist novels and feminist works during the Victorian era. I don't think I will write any books with any more modern or current themes because I'm very young still and I don't have the experience or expertise to comment on anything happening today. Why I chose to write in the Victorian era was because there were a lot of these qualified historians who had done the thoughtful and careful analysis that I know I could rely on to create a good novel and an accurate one at best.
你会在乎书的销量吗？
I would be very happy if my novel is successful. However, I think writing the novel has been more important to me. I think a lot of authors, when they write novels, they're writing to develop their own passion for literature and not because they want to prove to others anything. Obviously, I love reading and writing, but for other hobbies, such as sports, I swim and I do curling, which is the sport played on ice. For music, I play the saxophone. And what I love to do for relaxation, though, is to travel with my family. I think the joy of writing is in sharing it with others. If you take reading, for example, it can be a very personal thing. You're just sitting there with your own thoughts and exploring who you are and how the work has affected you. However, with writing, you're putting out your own thoughts and your own expression out onto a piece of paper, and it's sort of become this work of art that's best shared with others who can also interpret it and find new meaning in it. So I think the real joy in writing is being able to share it with others. For the future, I plan on getting a creative writing, history, or public policy degree in university or some other humanities option. For my novel writing, in the future, if I do plan on writing more novels, I plan on doing so after this one has already gone to the publisher.
我们是4口之家我和我先生呢是20多年前移民到加拿大的我们俩算是第1代的移民吧我们都不是从事与文学创作相关的工作，但是我们俩呢从小呢都喜欢读各种各样的书籍，也算是文学发烧友那我们有2个小朋友，老大呢就是 Leonardo， 今年17岁了，老二呢今年15岁。他们呢都是在温哥华出生的。Leonardo 呢，他在多项的写作竞赛里头拿了很多大奖，而且他的第1部小说也即将要发表了。我身边的很多朋友都向我取经。那其实我个人认为呢，一个优秀的作家呢是天生的，根本不是后天能够培养起来的。但是呢，一个孩子的良好的读书习惯和写作习惯呢，确实是可以从小培养的。在利昂纳多很小的时候呢，我们夫妻2个人就寓教于乐，鼓励他读历史书籍和自然科学的书籍。他年龄稍微大一点的时候呢，我们就建议他多读一些经典的小说和其他的他感兴趣的话题。那我经常对他说的一句就是：凡是你感兴趣的不管是阳春白雪还是下里巴人，你都可以拿来一读。所以他从小的时候呢，他的阅读量很大。还有他的阅读的范围很广，也很杂。为了能够读更多的书，他自己从小的时候呢，就有意识的培养他的阅读的速度。他到了12、13岁的时候，有一天他就突然跟我说：“他说妈妈，你知道吗？像砖头厚的一本书呢，我只要1天时间我就可以读完，而且呢，我可以记住里面的大部分的内容。”我们夫妻俩认为很重要的就是。我们是孩子的原生家庭，我们要给孩子做非常好的榜样。我们对孩子有期待的呢，我们自己首先也要能够努力做到。所以我在培养孩子成长的过程中呢，我一边呢是很努力勤奋的工作呢，我在工作之余呢，我自己也大量的读了很多的课外书，我还做了很多的阅读笔记，我还搞创作。自己呢会没事的时候呢就会写小说、写散文和杂文。10几年来呢，我自己也写了200-300万字。那么我把自己写的文章呢就发表在博客上， 也发表在每篇，跟身边的朋友分享。有的时候呢，我跟儿子那个聊天的时候，我就会提到说：“儿子啊，你知道吗？妈妈现在有几百万的读者在读我的文章了。”他听了以后呢，就很羡慕的，就跟我说：“妈妈，如果有一天呢，有几百万人也能够读我的小说的话，那是一件很值得自豪的事情。”后来呢，他自己就开始在课外的时间呢，他也写一些小作文，他写小故事，写散文，写诗歌。我们呢就会经常鼓励他说：“你心里想写什么呢？你就写下来。”不要有任何的题材上或者形式上的拘泥，就是把你的真实的想法写出来就行，能写就尽量写。13岁以后呢，我们就鼓励他去参加一些这个重量级的写作的赛事，我们把这一些比赛的资讯发给他，然后呢，他就会根据比赛的要求，从自己平常的习作里头挑一篇作文呢去参赛，结果呢获得了很不错的成绩，他连续获了好几个大奖，这个呢就给了他非常多的信心。他从去年开始的时候就下定决心自己要写一篇比较长的故事，写一个小说。他的第一部小说应该来说还是写得不错的，获得了美国的著名的出版商的赏识，很快就要发表了。那我们对他在这个年纪取得的小小的一点进步和成绩呢，我们还是感到非常满意的。
它是属于买一个书号这样出版呢，还是说是被那个主流的出版社看中？
这个问题其实也有很多朋友问过我。我们是联系了一个美国的主流社会的一个很著名的书商，这个书商呢，他出过2000多本书，其中将近300本都在主流社会获奖。他当时看到了我儿子的书稿以后呢，反馈是非常好，表示说马上要出书，但是不是说我帮你申请一个书号，马上就可以帮您出。他是要求5轮的改稿，然后是从他看中您的书稿到最后出版，大概有期间是将近1年的时间。第一轮的改稿呢，历时4个月的时间。那个一流的编辑啊，他们是非常严格。每一个礼拜呢，都要和我的儿子有半个小时的视频会议，因为这个我儿子是在温哥华，他们是在美国的东部嘛，所以有3个小时的时差。我儿子基本上上午6点钟就得爬起来，因为他要去上学，然后跟编辑有半个小时的沟通时间。他们是基本上是一个章节一个章节，一个个细节看过去，他和编辑之间有着非常热烈的讨论。有的时候我甚至认为是很激烈的讨论，因为编辑可能要求他做这样的修改，他不同意，他觉得要那样的修改更好。然后通常就是达成共识了以后呢，编辑就会把共识的东西呢写成一个个细节呢，就是放在这个网站上。那我儿子就可以根据他们这个讨论过的共识的结果进行修改。修改的意见是非常详细的，比如说要修改一个细节的时候，编辑会讲这个细节要加上一个人物的对话，或者就是加一个心理活动的描写，但是会写你要写多少字，加一个300字，或者是那个细节你还得改写，要再加个500字，哪一段话你可能要删掉几百字，重新再加上一段话，那段话大概要多少字？我儿子就是按照这个他们共同讨论的大纲呢，重新把第一稿重新修改过，这个工作量是非常大的。他很紧张的改了4个月，第一稿才通过。第一稿通过了以后，又进行紧锣密鼓的第2轮改稿。第2轮改稿主要是看他的小说的具体的情节和这个章节上有没有纰漏，没有纰漏的话才能达到出书的要求。但是因为是第1轮呢改得非常好，所以这个第2轮改稿很快就通过了。那直到这个时候，出版商才跟我儿子说，我们打算把你这个小说过几个月以后正式出版。那基本上是定在明年的1月份正式出版，但是从9月份到正式出版以前，他们还要花16个星期的时间，每个礼拜还要跟我儿子有半个小时的视频会议，然后还得进行3轮的小细节上的修改和校对，最后才能出书。所以我很高兴，因为我的儿子的反馈是经过的跟这些一流的出版商和一流的编辑的沟通啊，他自己认为他的写作能力大大提高。他说这种培训对他来说是炼狱式的，或者是醍醐灌顶的。这个是对他的人生来说是一个非常好的一个专业的写书的经验。 这次我们选择的是一个美国的主流的很有名的出版商，叫 Manuscript Inc。他们的对这个选稿是非常严格的，每年给他们出版社投稿的人很多，但是他们能选中的只有14%，所以这是一家非常严谨的，应该说是在行业里头口碑非常好的出版社。
你们需要为出版书号付费吗？
出版书号是不需要付费的。